Hello, my name is Claude Sharadi, and welcome to the show. Tonight, we are talking about African mindset. As many of you who have been watching the program over the last several weeks, on Friday night, we discuss African mindset. And I have a panel that will be discussing this issue with me. But before that, we're just going to go into a short introduction, and we'll be right back. Okay. Thank you very much. We're talking about African mindset, and I have five guests with me, and I'll just ask them to briefly introduce themselves. We'll start with Matima Befam. Go ahead. Ooh, maybe there's a bit of a connection problem there. Let's go with Dr. William. We'll come back to Matthew later.
Thank you, Clyde. Thank you very much, and thank you, my colleague who are also presenting with me today, and also thank you for the audience who are going to listen and who are also listening now. I just wanted to thank you guys. As just a quick introduction, my name is William Abur. I'm a social worker by profession, and I'm also a researcher, by profession. So I spend, time looking at social issues within the society. I'm currently a lecturer at Deakin University in social work department. So that is about me.
Okay. We'll go to Matthew Mabefam. You with us now?
Yes. So
Okay,
my
go
name is
ahead.
Dr. Matima Befam, and I am a development anthropologist. I currently teach at the University of Melbourne in development studies program, and I'm also a researcher, researching into issues that affect African mindset, both in the continent and in the diaspora.
Thank you. We'll go to James.
Hi everyone, and thanks Clyde for having us, and thanks to the colleagues. My name is James Lajogo. I'm from South Sudan. I've been here in Australia for quite a while, and I've got a lot of interest in issues to do with multiculturalism, identity, and culture. So that's why I'm also really interested to talk about these issues, because I know they do have impact, and the idea of mindset itself is a really interesting one. And we all bring different mindsets, and we're hoping that we will be able to learn from one another within this discussion.
Thank you. Barry, Mustafa Barry, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having us, Clyde. Happy to be here again. My name is Mustafa Bari, and I am a telecommunication specialist by trade. Very passionate about social issues, political issues, anything affecting the African continent and affecting Africans. So happy to be in this panel tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. And we have Eugene Allman.
You're on mute.
Actually,
I did?
sorry. Yeah, go ahead. I think I had you on mute. So it's my mistake. Go ahead.
No problem. I was just saying thank you for having me. This is my first time here, and I'm very happy to be here and meet everyone.
Yes.
My name is Eugene. I was born in Russia. I grew up in Sydney. I am currently in Sydney, but I have been living and working in various parts of Africa for 20 years now, since 2001. I'm a freelance filmmaker, documentary filmmaker, and writer. And these days I call Johannesburg home.
Okay.
But you forgot to tell everyone, Eugene, that you're also a passionate African, passionate about music, passionate about movies, passionate about cinema and about music and social issues in Africa. And you are an African too. in many, many ways. You're probably more African than we are.
Well, I mean, look, I think the African continent has adopted me, and I feel very much at home in a lot of places where I've lived. And yes, I do have a very close affinity with African culture and African music. I write about music for newspapers and so on as well. And I'm sort of become a part of the arts community in some of the cities where I've lived. So yeah, so I hope I'm very happy to be part of this conversation.
Thank you very much. Well, that's good, Eugene, because you actually may even know more about Africa than some of us here, because I haven't been to Africa over the last 10 years. The last time I went back there was about 11 years ago, and only spent 2 weeks. So you've been there many more times, so you probably know a lot more and then at least what has happened over the last decade or so. All right, so we're talking about the African mindset, and again, as usual, we just want to clarify, when you say African mindset, there's nothing really that qualifies as African mindset for all Africans, because mindset is linked to individuals, societies, and lots of contexts. But when you say African mindset, we're making broad, general assumption that there's a particular way that many Africans may think, and that's just for the purpose of doing some analysis in relation to what has affected the thinking and the behaving, the interacting between Africans, and how they see the world and how they interact with each other and the rest of the world. So the topic tonight is really about the role of education in influencing mindset. And there are many forms of education, formal, informal, non-formal, many ways that people get educated. So we want to look at how that has affected the African mindset from the beginning. I mean, basically from the pre-colonial history to now. So the question I want to put to you guys tonight is, can you think of what are some of the main factors that you think have affected the education of Africans from pre-colonial time to now? If you can name a few and why you think those are important. So any one of you can jump on. Perhaps we start with
yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
No. I was gonna say we start with Barry.
Okay, so what I wanted to do, I probably want get into the pre-colonial side of things, because I think Matthew probably would be more kind of competent in making kind of some analysis on that. But what I can say, in terms of our mindset and education, if you take it in the current context, I think in many ways we are very much still influenced by the colonial legacy. Our educational programs, like I said here in the past, for most of our countries, if not all, I'm talking about the 54 countries that make up the African continent, are still very much extroverted, because they don't address actually the historical context, the economic context, the social context of where we are, of where we're coming from, and who we are. And I think it's about time that when we make an assessment of what our education system have done to us or have done for us for the last 60 years, it would be important to make that assessment and to understand what is there, the pluses, the minuses, and make a conclusion as to what needs to be changed. A lot needs to be changed. When it comes to having a political and historical consciousness, the current educational system we have in our countries don't help our young people, didn't help us, and won't help our young people getting that consciousness of us being who we are in terms of the societies, in terms of like kind of the African context, because we don't know much about each other. We don't know about who we are, where we're coming from, and about our history, something that make us proud and understand what are the main critical issues that are facing us and how urgent it is to address them. Our education system doesn't address that, and it's important that it's about time that it changes.
Thank you, Barry.
I can jump in there before my colleague come in.
Yep.
I agree with Barry with Barry in terms of education. The African the concept of education in Africa is still not helping the society. You would find that uh, you know although there's mostly in the city you could find, yes, there is a basic education that people are learning, and but people are not yet given the tool how to think independently. That is a challenge that the African society are having at the moment. But I do also wanted to acknowledge that African people traditionally they do have great philosophies. There are a lot of great ideas that if they were to be implemented, that would have been build the society in a better direction. But unfortunately, those ideas, most of them are just are still in oral concept. They are oral ideas, and I could also refer to some of the things that some of the stories that I heard when I was a young boy, and I still heard them up to now, and nothing has been documented. Those philosophy are great until now. If you look at one of the ideas that we have, which has been documented, is the idea of Ubuntu. The concept of Ubuntu is a very strong concept that the African people believe that I cannot live without, I cannot live without people. I'm not an island. I'm somebody that live within the society, and you and I, we can make the society. We can make, a good development. But that thinking, that concept that you and I we can make different, it need to be implemented. It need to be done. It need to be thought properly, and it need to be implemented. Action need to be put in term of community development, in term of social development, in term of whether the political wills or other ideas that could be cultural development. I think that need to be put in in a context that can help the society.
Okay. Yep.
Mm.
Take the floor anytime. Any of you?
If you don't mind, I could jump in.
Yeah,
And I
go
was
ahead.
gonna say, first of all, like when we talk about education, let's remind ourselves what it is, because again, education, is the transmission of knowledge that is used for the betterment of society.
Mm-hmm.
And when we talk about pre-colonial times, education was very individually focused. It was not necessarily individually focused. It was an oral tradition where elders passed that knowledge to the younger ones. And it could be that somebody is really interested in hunting, so they get linked with somebody who is very good at hunting, and they learn the skills that they need to be a good hunter,
Mm-hmm.
or that somebody is a good storyteller. They will link up with somebody who tells good stories, metal work, blacksmithing, all that stuff, looking after cattle. There was some system of practical applications for day to day use.
Mm-hmm.
um, and there was something about that William just touched on. They said there is a lot of really good concepts that we could apply, like from that time, that and we still do think about them a lot, but we could apply them to now. And then apart from Ubuntu, for example, the idea of justice, what does it mean to be to have justice or fairness? So for example, a lot of African societies, their sense of justice is not to punish the individual and then cast them away as the bad guy. There is the belief that that person can change, and that the idea of justice is not to punish somebody but to restore relationships and connection, and being and back into community, that you are not necessarily a bad person, but we like the idea of justice is to bring that person back, repair the relationships, repair the damage that has been done, and then you move on. It's a little bit different from how Western societal idea of justice is, for
Mm-hmm.
example. Yeah.
Okay.
So this. There's a lot of those concepts that we have that I think can apply, can be very useful in the global context too.
Sure. Dr. Matthew?
At this stage, and I wanted to look at the concept of education within different contexts, because I believe that different contexts and different factors affected and shaped the minds of Africans along the way. So if we look at prehistorical, pre-colonial societies, as my colleague just mentioned, yes, education was more oral, and the intent of education was to transfer knowledge from one generation to another. And these were usually very practical in nature, in that different people with their different experiences and expectations in societies transferred it to individuals within society who wanted that form of education. So for example, if we're talking about farming, communities that were farming oriented, their children automatically learn from their parents as to how to farm. And this kind of learning was not just theoretical, it was practical in a sense that they go along with their parents to their farms to learn how to farm as well. Growing up as a child, I had my own farm alongside my father's, and I mimicked exactly whatever my father did. I mimicked it in my own farm as well. That was my first level of education. If you went to fishing communities, it's the same way, where parents taught their kids how to fish. And if you went to other communities, that was how things were done. What that meant is that people transferred and learned the skills that were necessary for them to exist and to live well within their societies. And that kind of education was more sustainable in that people learned the skills that they wanted and they used those skills practically. I would also say that despite the fact that it's oral and practical in nature, in that some of the things were not documented in the formal form as we have it today, written down in text, there were other ways that this education could be learned. Some of them were manifested in terms of music, the kind of music that people had in society, the kind of artwork that people had. You could use that to tell elements of people's ways of life through that. So that is very important to highlight. Moving from there to the colonial era, change and different factors came into influence the kind of education that we have now and the kind of impact that it has had on the African mind. And I would love to say that there are different factors that has influenced education and affected or changed or influenced the African mind. But the most important of them all is colonization. And when I say colonization, I mean the colonization or the form of education that came with colonization changed the landscape of Africa and would continue to influence on the way we think and the way we do things. One of the things that I would like to highlight about the colonial form of education is what was the intent of that form of education and what was it seeking to highlight? First and foremost, you will realize that it was actually meant to benefit the colonialist. So the first form of education that was instituted was to train people how to be secretaries, to assist them, and not to actually give them skills to be able to work independently on their own. So that form of education was more administrative kind of education, where people just learn to be assistants in offices of the colonial administration or to be interpreters to help in translating the form of communication that they wanted to have to the people. And that form of education, I would go further to say that it was instituted depending on what resources were located in different parts of Africa. So as you realize, you would notice that parts of Africa that did not have much of resources, even within the same country, they were deprived as compared to areas that had education, and that had resources, and there was some form of, they needed some form of translation as a way of getting into the people and getting what they wanted. So for instance, you realize that if we take Ghana, for example, the southern part where there was more resources that the colonialists wanted, there was more structured formal educational structures to train people to serve as a middle person to engage with the people as compared to the northern part of Ghana that did not seem to have much resources. And even when the need became that they should introduce education to the sector, it was limited to only the children of the royal family. And that was because the system of indirect rule, they needed to have a direct encounter with the chiefs. And the children of the chiefs became that middle ground point to be educated to serve that purpose. So that is how I would conceptualize the form of education that came as a result of colonization. Moving forward and also situating it within that context, you again realize that the thinking or the era in the Western world also kind of was transferred into these people who were educated. And what I'm saying is that if you look at that time, that was the Victorian era. And if you look at the elements of the Victorian era in Europe, you realize that the kind of education that came to the colonial territories in Africa kind of also mimic that. So for example, and I like to touch a few on gender issues with regards to Africa. What was the ideal role of a woman within the Victorian era in Europe? The ideal woman was supposed to be a good wife and was supposed to be help the husband achieve his agenda. The kind of education that started in Africa as well mimicked that, where women were trained to actually be good women, good wives, to actually help the agenda of their husbands. And how did that look like? And what kind of roles that were given to women in the form of training? That shaped the kind of roles that women actually performed at home. That is weaving, cooking, and a few went out to engage in care work such as teaching and nursing, etc. I could keep going and going, but I'm quite aware that we have others who will speak, and I'll definitely come back to other issues. And these issues have all shaped the African mind and the kind of education that we have. But there are more issues or factors that I would talk about as we progress with this interview.
Absolutely, Eugene. What?
Yeah, look, I think the 2 points about the Victorian era, which shaped African education up until this day, that hasn't been reformed. I think that's a crucial point. And also the connection with resources and the level of education, I think is really very, very, very important point. My observation is that when I have encountered teachers in Africa who are coming from a traditional space, so traditional healers, traditional, the sages, as it were, they talk about concepts such as diplomacy. How do you harmonize between conflicting interests? They talk about creative problem solving. They talk about things that are actually very progressive concepts, and they are very practical in terms of how they want to get that message across and how they want to teach it. The formal education system in Africa, in the majority of African countries, has not been fundamentally reformed since the Victorian era. And so it emphasizes things like remembering information, so that when you pass exams, you have to remember facts. Following instructions, following orders, those sorts of things. If you don't follow instructions, you get beaten. Things that basically prevent things like critical thinking and diplomacy and creative problem solving. And the reason for that is as we've heard, is that this is a toxic system that was implemented in order to basically create an infrastructure for removing resources from the continent, and that hasn't fundamentally been reformed properly. And so what you had was a situation where teachers, and I would argue parents, African parents, were turned into service providers for white supremacy. There was a concrete agenda of the destruction of the African family. Send the father to work in the mines, send the mother to work as a domestic servant, send the children to boarding school where they don't have contact with grandparents and wisdom and all these other influences. It was an active program of destruction. And so I would argue that education reform today, I would argue that it's the number one most urgent and critical problem in Africa. I think that it's something that is can be addressed very immediately. You know, there's things that we talk about a lot as African problems, like, you know, your currency is controlled by a foreign power, things that are not so easy to solve like immediately. You can talk about them, but they're kind of like global problems, you know, that will take a long time to resolve. But the problem of how children are brought up and educated is absolutely and ultimately, I believe, the most urgent problem that needs to be addressed, because there's a kind of disconnect that's happening where, for example, we saw last year the protests in Nigeria against, you know, NSAS, against police brutality and so on. And yet, this is the brutality that children are brought up with in their homes and in their schools. So then you ask, like how do you bring up your children by beating them for making mistakes, and then you're surprised that there's police brutality and there's violence from the government? Like, how, you know, how are those, how do people not see that those things are connected? So that would be my main point, I think, is that this is a toxic legacy of colonialism, and it won't go away by itself. It won't just go away with time. It needs to be, you know, there has to be an aggressive, robust program of understanding how do we incorporate traditional values, how do we harmonize them in a modern context, how do we do this in a way that actually works for people, you know, to be able to develop and solve problems better.
Okay, very interesting points there from everyone. Obviously, there are a lot of issues in relation to the education system in most African countries, and I suppose there are, you know, different ways of looking at that. But let me go back a bit onto the sort of pre-colonial history to just ask one question. We know that it has been said here, many countries, or pretty much the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, the education was centered mostly on orality. It was transferred through oral forms. Now, do you think that orality has somehow disadvantaged the African when looking at things now? The fact that many of the much of the wisdom, the knowledge, the insight that have been built over generations could not be put in written form so that it can eventually be built upon and develop further? Do you think that orality, as much as it has its benefit, but it also has significant issues with it?
I would. Can I jump in before the
Yeah,
rest?
yeah. The question is to everyone.
Um, yes, good question. Good question, Clyde. Looking at the oral history in Africa, and I wanted to link it back to my own, my own society or my own community. There are, being a researcher, there are I mean, great stories, great stories that I was, that a community here or I was told before, um, but they are not put in. Those stories are not in a written form,
Mhm.
and to me, it is giving us as a society, is putting us in disadvantaged position, because there is no way that you can actually reference. If you are a researcher and come up with that story, you need to be able to back it up so that anybody that want, or any generation that want to look to read the story, they may be able to, to reference it and get it where it come from. So those are the challenges that we are having with those those oral great oral stories that are not being documented. So I think the current generation in Africa, the younger generation that are emerging now, that does not even have the time to sit with the elders and for elders to tell them the story. Those generation will lose, will not get that. Will
Mm.
actually, those great stories, they will lose them. Except maybe the few stories that are written, maybe the rest will be able to hang on there and say, okay, this is this is my culture, or this is what I'm connected with. Um, so it is a great challenge that we need as a society. I think we need to think about the better ways that we can document this. One way is, for example, it needs somebody to go in a village, for example, to go and sit with those elders and interview them and document them and write, maybe in form of book or in form of whatever that you could put. And the benefit is, it can it can remain with the next generation. So if somebody go in the village and sit with the elders and document the story, let those elders tell the story. And I'm talking about, of the senior one, very 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 senior elders, to tell their story, how things were in Africa, and what helped people, in the village, and how do people govern themselves, how do people, the society rule themselves when issues come, which has been already been touched by some of my friends there. So when they talk about how the system works, there are some good things that need to benefit the next generation. But if we don't document them, it will, in the next few years, the younger generation will not benefit from it. So that's how I see it. That bring a critical thinking, though. We need to have a critical thinking and bring the critical thinking back to the community, and for the community to be able to do the right thing for themselves.
Clyde, can I jump in? I think you're on mute too, Clyde.
Sorry, I even forgot that I put myself on mute. Now,
Okay, on mute.
before you jump in, let me just remind those watching that you're watching African Knowledge on African Media Australia. We're talking about analyzing African mindset, and we're looking at factors that have affected the education of Africans from pre-colonial time to now. Before you take the floor, Barry, let me add to that. And first, actually, before I forget, I want to remind you, because the fact that there are so many of us, if you can try to be brief, that will be better, so we can touch on more points, because we're already 30 minutes from when we started. It goes so fast. We'll probably go up to maybe a little over an hour tonight. And then before you go, Barry, I'm saying, in addition to the issue of whether or not orality has somehow disadvantaged us on the path to development, I also want to bring the fact that as that transmission of knowledge through oral tradition is reducing, we're also seeing absence of sort of culturally relevant content that academics or other people, other scientists from African background can actually produce. And these two things put together, they actually are a bit of a problem for development. But I'd like you to talk about that and anything else that comes to your mind. Go ahead, Barry.
Yeah. Now, on the issue of orality, I think yes, it can be put on the floor. Nothing though that we need to put here forward is the fact that orality, as kind of as a whole for the whole African continent, is not something that is actually, yes, probably most of our societies are oral societies, but not all of them. We do have kind of some parts of Africa where traditions, values, philosophies, concepts have been have existed in written form at pre-colonial times. There are, and now to come back
about
to
like the Ethiopian tradition,
yes,
for example.
we're
Maybe
talking about Ethiopian
give some
traditions.
examples.
We're talking Ethiopian tradition. We're talking about even if you take in some western part of the African continent, like in part of Cameroon. If part of Cameroon, in Timbuktu and all that, we did have kind of some written elements from that have been left. Now, a lot of things have caught up with us. A lot of things have caught up with our societies. Now, to come back to our the orality, I think we need to put that also into context, okay? Because orality at the time did serve well for the purpose that it was kind of meant to serve. And when the context changed, we're talking about not only colonialism, but not only kind of a world that was value that were, concepts that are open to the rest of the world and everything, then orality can be a problem. When we're talking about collecting data, researching and stuff like that, orality can be a problem. But even nowadays, I think orality, if you look at it like kind of in many of the societies, you realize that in actual fact, we can, if it's done properly, you can get a lot of good and reliable information through orality. It's just a matter of how methodically we do it. Okay, so I think the other thing in terms of our education taken into our moral context, there are a lot of things, our values, even if they transmitted from generation to generation in oral means. But the problem is that we haven't been able to take those concepts and apply them into our education systems. William has talked about the concept of Ubuntu, but it's something that is actually probably common to most of all our societies in Africa. The concept of me, we. So I am only through others. It's something that exists throughout the continent because we believe in community, we believe in togetherness, we believe in all this concept that hold us together, which is totally opposed to what we're facing today, which is capitalism, which is accumulation of wealth, which is individualism and stuff like that. It's totally different. So I think it would have been sensible for any reform that needs to be done in terms of the education to take all that into account and to build a system that is adapted to our realities. Because our realities at the moment, and like Eugene has said, until now, whether you take the Victorian system, whether you take the French educational system that was left behind in the former French colonies or in Portuguese-speaking countries, nothing much has changed. We're still facing the same challenges, and something has to be done about that.
Okay. Who wants to go next?
I think I would love to jump in here.
Go ahead.
And one of the things I would like to say is society is an evolving one. And I'm not too sure whether with or without colonization and the Western form of education, whether African societies would have remained oral to today. And I'm saying that because as society move or progress, perhaps there would have been our own form of ways of capturing or even putting things to text. So orality definitely has its role in society, and it played its role in pre-colonial era. And I would say that it established a strong relationship between the young and the old. And that brought some form of respectability. That age was very important, and the experience that people have had on this earth kind of demonstrated the way they have perfected the art that they are involved in. And young ones who wanted to learn from them needed to accord them some level of respectability to be able to get that knowledge. So it was one for the purposes of relationship building. And that, I would say, is a great thing. The second point I would like to say is that when we talk about, I think the issue that is being conflicted here is how to navigate the African ways of knowing and producing knowledge and the Western ways of knowing and producing knowledge as we have it now. The Western ways of knowing and verifying things is about giving specific reference to who said this and who said that in the form of putting it to articles that when you want to talk about it, you can say maybe Clyde in 2020 said this, or William in 2021 said this. I think with regards to oral tradition, they also had forms of references. But because this knowledge was communally owned, it would be difficult to attribute that to a particular individual, that this particular idea, this particular philosophy, this particular value is for this person. And I think that is very important because sometimes even in Western form of knowledge creation, what we attribute to individuals as their form of knowledge that we make reference to is not actually theirs. So for instance, if I saw all of us here today as a research group and I ask you things and I now go to put together that thing, then Matthew owns that knowledge. When in actual fact, it's collective knowledge of all of us here. So I think that is something that we have to be very to highlight. But the point is that I agree that as society advances and progresses, and we are now juggling between orality as a form of passing down knowledge and writing texts and transmitting knowledge through that, definitely a problem would emerge in that young people, young children who have not enrolled in the formal education, they are now learning a different mode of reasoning and a different mode of constructing and creating knowledge. And that has undervalued the other ways of creating knowledge, and that has not been valued as much as supposed to be. And that we have to find a mediating point. But of course, I do agree that we have to begin to document things. Otherwise, a lot of things, knowledge, local knowledge, are going to be lost because since we are no longer valuing and going to the elders to learn from them, in the next generation, that disconnection would have made us lose the valuable knowledge that they have. So for us to have that continuity, then there's a need for us to put it into writing, and so that we can capture it and the next generation would have it.
All right, Eugene, do you got any insight?
I love books. I grew up in a house with thousands of books, and my parents are academics, and I understand the importance of literature and books and references and all of those things. But I don't think that oral culture is a disadvantage at all. And in fact, I think that as a global culture, we're moving more towards oral culture, and we're moving more towards giving oral tradition its rightful place in society. I mean, all you have to do is look at YouTube and see the incredible documentation of storytellers and young people who have food channels, going to their grandmothers, asking them to show them how do you make this recipe and so on. This is oral tradition, and it's actually the technology that we have today is bringing young people and older people together, because the tools for capturing this knowledge at everyone's, well, maybe not necessarily everyone's, but more and more people's disposal. And I think that accumulating a library that's video and audio and recording in that way, which is oral culture recorded, and it doesn't have to be in a book. It can be on a video. It can be on the internet. These things can exist side by side, and they have equal value. So I don't see it as a disadvantage at all.
But I suppose the new form of orality or oracy is that it's actually both oral and documented. Because if you look at YouTube, it's obviously the audio, visual, video communication is very, very is embraced everywhere. But so it mixes the oral aspect with the documentation aspect, because you can go back to it, you can watch it, you can hear it, you can. So, but the fact that we only had that oracy that is limited only in one person to a person or to a very small group, and then there's no way of going back to get look at it differently or get the juice of it and build up on it. That has perhaps
I probably would probably challenge that a bit. I think we're taking kind of comparing different contexts here. I found the idea of the example that Eugene has given very interesting, like how we're moving towards more oral kind of tradition with the current technologies. That's a very, very interesting way of looking at it, because if we're talking about how knowledge has been transmitted, if you take the oral tradition in the olden days, it's actually not from one person got all the knowledge. It's actually the societies are structured in such a way that information is not lost. It's transmitted between families, between generations, between people, because each kind of there was group that had a particular role in societies. So you can take that through like kind of a network of people. If you look at it very closely, I think philosophically, you probably will see a lot of similarities. Yes, oral tradition got a lot of weaknesses, but I think we shouldn't discount the fact that it got its strengths as well. And thanks to that strength, we still have kind of a lot of values that we hold in today. When you're talking about music, when you're talking about concept, when you're talking about all of things that have been transmitted from centuries or 1,000 years ago, it's still there, and it adapted. It's open to adaptation. Which is the interesting part of it. So I found that very interesting what Eugene was developing earlier. Very interesting.
And I want us to move to the next point. And if anyone still wants to make a point about oracy or anything like that, you can do that when you talk about the next point as well. The issue with, the next point is that it has been mentioned here that if you look at the education system in Africa, for most countries, we still have not really done the reforms that needs to be done to change our education system. And I wonder why that is the case, because we've got everything that we need to be able to make these changes if we want to. But political leaders, for some reason, have not seen that need. What's going on?
Yeah, but if I can jump in here, like just give a perspective. In Senegal or other French-speaking countries, straight after colonization, what I can say, I think there was attempt to reform the system. What we call a program called IPAM is kind of an institute of a Pan-African institute of French-speaking countries that got together and tried to write a new program, school program for children. But that was in the early days, in the 1960s, 1970s, that was attempted. But it didn't go deep enough. It didn't go far enough, because all what it did, it just tried basically to change certain superficial things, like kind of the people or the characters in the books and all that. But in actual fact, the deep content didn't change. And then another reform has happened in many countries, like in Western Africa, again French-speaking countries, where reform has been made to help like kind of kids be more proficient in reading and writing. And then philosophy programs and all that have been adjusted. But like I said again, it didn't go far enough. Nothing has been done to dig deep and understand when it comes to our oral traditions, social values, social concepts, philosophical concepts, take them back into the school system and adapt them to our realities. Nothing deep like that didn't happen. And the other thing also, what is important, is that it actually, all those reforms didn't push into kind of helping us being together and seeing each other together as Africans. Everyone was making their reforms in their own corner. And like I was saying, so much so that we still as Africans, we still divided in terms of the colonizers, like kind of the French-speaking people and the French-speaking, kind English-speaking, don't know much about each other. We almost don't talk about each other. And that's a problem. That's a shame. Because here is, we are Africans, first and foremost, but we are divided based on the colonial legacy, and it's a big problem. We don't know much about Uganda. We don't know much about Zimbabwe. We don't know even what they say. We don't even know what people eat in this part of the world. And that's a shame. And there are so many things that we need to address, but you can't ask people who don't know what to reform a system and get effectively what needs to be, get it right. We need to have people who have a deep understanding of what the issues are and address them accordingly. Sorry.
James, you haven't spoken for a while, and I'll let you to speak now, but I'll ask a question on top of that. Is saying, do you think that one of the reasons why the politicians have not really given enough attention and sufficient resources for the reform of the education system is because they've been too busy trying to maintain their power, or are there other reasons? You on mute. You put yourself on mute.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Well, so Barry has said some really, really important things there. One of it being that we have held onto this system of education that's antiquated, but it wasn't designed for us. It wasn't designed to benefit us, or designed to benefit Europeans and the colonizers. And recently, somebody told me this story of a lady who got this, a chart with ABCDs on it. Yeah. And on the ABCD, they have pictures. They have pictures of things to demonstrate how the letter is used. And then on the A, there was an apple, right? what she realized then was that, well, on the African continent, there's not a lot of apples actually. So people in Kenya, let's say people in South Sudan, they don't grow apples. So what that does is that makes people not value their own environment. They want, then they be wanting something that is foreign. We want something that is foreign. So for example, the A for apple stuff. You know, how about we change it to something that is actually local, that people know and connect to and experience every day? So what has happened is that a lot of these leaders still have that thinking that anything that is foreign, anything that is aligned with the European way of doing things is the correct way. And that has been passed on from since colonial times up to now. And so we start to look down on our own ideas. We start to look down on our own knowledge. We start to look down on our own cultures and identities. We don't trust each other as Africans, for example, because we want to meet in Europe to talk about African problems. Like that is happening a lot. And there, when you think Eurocentric, you're rewarded as well. And so a lot of these leaders, they want to maintain that relationship with their colonial masters, so that they will be rewarded. They will be seen as the good guys, the people who reform. And they think reform is about how we can adjust and conform to European standards and European mindset and ways of thinking.
All right. Dr. Matthew, you got something to add on that?
Definitely,
what's the reason?
Yeah, I got something to add, and I would like to go a bit conceptual here. I think what we are actually talking about, it could be given different terms, but I would like to term it as decolonization or decolonizing education. And this battle that we are talking about today is not new. Our predecessors, even in the early 60s, did talk about the same issues and how to navigate around by decolonizing education. Education is a software that installs, or education is an infrastructure that installs some form of software in our minds. And once that kind of software is installed, it's difficult for us to change. So that's where we start from. In that, the most important thing is the mode of reasoning, what we call intellectual acculturation. And whether we study in the West or back home, our educational system, as we have said, is designed to mimic the Western way of doing things and the Western way of thinking, which is what we call intellectual acculturation. So most of us who think we are Africans, we actually are Africans in bodies, but we have a software that is not African. So when you become a political leader, how are you going to change something that you yourself, you are a walking caricature of that? When your whole mode of reasoning is formatted along a software that is your working infrastructure. That's where the issue is. And I like to cite two examples. And you realize one key personality that in the 1960s, when this debate arose, was Ali Mazroui's academic work, intellectual work. And East Africa actually played a profound role in this kind of intellectual debate, especially looking at University of Dar es Salaam and University of Makerere. And in that, Ali Mazrui wrote a paper called Tanzanphilia. And there he unpacks and says that the personhood of Julius Nyerere is the demonstration of Western intellectuality. In that, for example, in Tanzania, the British form of education there was Western. He went to university in UK. So the software that he has was actually, his whole being of thinking was more Western. And he makes a distinction between values and that kind of intellectual acculturation. Values, we can easily do away with them as they are changeable. So for instance, if I was grown to believe that a particular form of way of life is what is good for me, and I do realize that those kind of values is not what I want, I can easily change. But the installation of mode of reasoning, which constitutes the totality of me through my educational system, is difficult to change. Change to what? What else do you know? So if we look at the kind of education that we are starting in Africa, it's because of the mode of reasoning that has been installed in our minds. And whether we are in the West or we are in Africa, we are Westernized, and that's all we know. So what is the alternative? What do you change to? If people have And they've made a few proposals. And we can go back to Ngugu Wachiango's book, Decolonizing the Mind, which he tackles the issue of language. The issue of language, one of the things you realize that in most African homes, we have local dialects where we actually think in that but write in a different language. That in itself brings a kind of disconnection and it's difficult. So for me, the reason why we find it or we are struggling to distance ourselves and install a particular form of education that is African-centric and addresses the needs of Africa is a mode of resilience, which is intellectual acculturation.
Okay, so we need to uninstall the cognitive matrix, so to speak, that is from the West, and install a new one, which is a very, very big job. Eugene, I saw you wanting to intervene. Go ahead.
That's a brilliant point. That's a brilliant point. However, like the thing about reforming education is when you start thinking about how do you practically do that, how do you approach this, it can't be separated from political reform. And your question about why don't the politicians reform education, that's the answer, because this is the system that put them in power. This is the system that benefits them. So they're not going to change it because, again, the issue of language is very important. These people run their governments and their parliaments and everything in a colonial language, which means that somebody who's extremely wise and educated and is able to solve problems but comes from a traditional space can't get elected to this parliament because they're not fluent in English or French or whatever it is. Right? So they're barred from the political system. They're barred from making their input effectively. And the people who are in power perpetuate this thing because they're comfortable with the system, and this is the system that has put them in their positions. So, and just South Africa, which I don't want to idealize because South Africa has its own problems and so on. But one of the things that makes me very optimistic about South Africa and very positive about South Africa is that they have collectively said everything we did in the past was wrong. Like, let's agree on this. We cannot be attached to it. We cannot romanticize it. Everything the entire thing was wrong. And we have to start from the beginning and discuss and find a new way of doing things. And this is a very liberating thing. And I don't think it's happened in a lot of countries where they've said, we're not colonies anymore. We're independent. We have our own presidents. We have our own things. But no one has really sat down and broken it down into detail. Like, how do we, detail by detail, how do we decolonize urban planning, public transport, the healthcare system, like everything in practical detail. And this is what you have to do. It's not going to happen by itself.
And I suppose partly the reasons why this has not happened because it touches on so many other things. If you want to reform the education, you need to have political will. You need to have economic resources. You need to bring the population along. You need to talk about language. So there's a whole lot of
conversation that you have to start.
It's a very deep conversation that has not been even initiated. So that's a bit tough. Now we're moving forward, and I'm just conscious of time. Let's not try to get into some sort of solution mode. We've sort of highlighted some of the issues, but then how do we start making changes? We know that, as we just said, the reform of education will involve a lot of things, but where should we start? What can we advise people in power in Africa with regards to what needs to be done to start making changes that are needed in this space? And then I'll take some comment and question from the audience.
Can I jump in there and maybe the rest will come? I just wanted to link this point, Clyde, with the point that has been touched before, the point of the power. How do we change, and how do we bring the reform within the education in African society? It is quite challenging. So the reform can only happen when the leaders allowed the critical thinkers, independent thinkers that can come in to look at the system and make some changes or put some suggestions that can also, you know, remove those leaders who are also the gatekeepers of change. Because one of the bigger problems that people are facing, when you go in the power, you have your group, you have your elite group that can protect you, and the only work that they do is to ensure that there is no any other thing that can come in to to destruct the system. So they hold on resources and they protect those resources, and they ensure that there's no anybody that have a different philosophy, different thinking, to come in and say, okay, this is a bad one. We need to bring in the the new way of doing things. So that's a bigger challenge at the moment that we face, the issue of power. I think if there is any way that our leaders can say, okay, I'm a leader, and therefore what I need um, those independent thinking, a critical thinker that can come in, look at the work, whether it is a government work or whether there is a society work. Let's look at it critically. What need to be changed and what need to be, maintained in terms of the society to say, well, we need to hold on this, whether it is a culture or whether it is a system that has been put in terms of decolonizing the west the system that was brought by the colonizers. So I think that will be the approach, but unfortunately, I think I don't know how our leaders, some of them are not ready for change. They wanted to protect so that they can remain in the power.
Okay, Dr. Matthew, what as a specialist sort of in this area, what do you think are some of the things that politicians should should I mean, not just politicians, because actually politicians act on the social pressure, so to speak. We need to put pressure on them to be able to change. But how do we start addressing some of these things? Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Start again. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think one other thing I would say is that, as it has been demonstrated here, we are always very good at diagnosing the problem. But when it comes to solutions, that's where the challenge is.
Mhm.
And the fact that you are convenient and you have thrown this question to us, that's a big challenge for us to think of how we can propose practical solutions that can help reform our educational institutions back home. And I would say, as I said last week, that there's no general template that I would recommend that we use to reform educational system in different African countries. But I would say that each country needs to really look at what are its strengths. What is it good at? So, for example, if we take Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire into consideration, which are leading producers of cocoa, that's agriculture, right? So it means that one of the things that Ghana could actually do is to invest in agriculture and invest in agriculture education so that people would have the technical know-how to use that kind of skill to improve the cocoa production. And that would lead to yields that would be very great for the continent, the countries, and the global community, because we love chocolate. It needs to be connected into what we call technology, because it's not just about the production of cocoa, it's about changing that cocoa to a different product that people will love. So we need to move beyond just producing cocoa to value addition. And then the question is, if we need to add value to the cocoa that we produce in these countries, what do we need to do that? What kind of education do we need? These are practical things that we think and localize this way of doing things. Then you can easily look, we need technology, we need agricultural technology. Who has it? There's no need or there's no problem going to learn from who has it to come and implement. After all, if you learn elsewhere and you bring that knowledge, it's not yours. Nobody can come and say, oh, this is my knowledge. As far as it's benefiting your society, that is it. The second thing I would say is we need to start looking at technical education in Africa. And different countries need to start looking at technical education. Technical education in a sense that we need people with practical skills to construct roads, to build our educational system, infrastructure, and the continuous looking outside to bring contractors to come and do that. It's not gaining so much for us. We are paying more. where we could have easily invested into training people who can actually do that. And they are in-house, they are within the continent. And that is more beneficial. We have those people, they're not going to go anywhere. They are going to live in those countries and continue to offer their services. So that is the second point that I would say. And that is connected to my last point, which is trade. The third point is that when you give people these hands-on skills, even if you don't employ them, they're able to do their own work. If you have carpenters and you need carpentry work and people have the skills, they go and do it. And in that order, and I think that the issue of unemployment, which I talked about last week, would be solved. People, in as much as they will be looking to government for employment and private sector, they can also create their own jobs, entrepreneurship. So we need to really look at the whole educational system and look at what we can actually do to transform that. And these are some of the things that I've mentioned. But I think that it all depends on leadership and the connection between academia, as William mentioned. There need to be some thinking, some research into that, and use that to actually reform the system and not just based on opinions. And that would be my point. And that's where politicians, our political leaders also come in. They need to give us the political will to be able to do that.
Okay, well, I guess we can talk about what the politicians or the decision makers do, but also we need to talk about what the general member of the public can do in terms of this. And one comment from John, who's watching and commenting, I suppose is quite relevant here. He says, despite an increase in documentation of knowledge in Africa, the culture of reading is still poorly developed. What's your take on this? There is also discrimination of documented knowledge from global south, especially from Africa. For example, much of the research carried out in Africa isn't regarded as important. How can this be resolved? So there's that issue of I suppose reading that's important, and then research, and even ourselves, we don't value our own research. I would rather quote somebody from the West. Again, we're talking about that colonial matrix, so to speak, that is still you know driving us to behave in the way we do. But I don't know who wants to take this and this
Yeah,
particular.
probably I would comment to that. Probably the issue of researchers, where I think if our research is not valued, it's more to do with our economical position. If you don't bring much on the table, if you're dependent, you depend on handouts and all that. What you bring out on the table doesn't matter, because in actual fact, people no one takes you seriously. I think that's important. It is important that we reclaim actually our own destiny, and rather than relying on a foreign aid or foreign whatever on all that to make us kind of progress. We need to start thinking, and that's where education will come back again. We need to reform the whole system. We need to make sure that we reform the system in such a way Africans will at last be able to reclaim kind of their history, reclaim their values, and reclaim who they are, and try to build kind of a new type of African who will be able to participate and to contribute in science, in research, in philosophy, and everything with pride and responsibility. I think the system has to be reformed. That's for, because at the moment the system, like I say, is extroverted. It's not serving us. It's not helping us. The first thing that needs to be done, we do have something called the African Union. If that African Union has to be useful, I think it has to start with that. They should probably start by building a template that will help each country to be able to look at that and say, okay, what is the core concept on which I will be based on to reform the system? If you take, for example, Ubuntu and community development is going to be your core concept. Let's see how you're going to build history and interrogate your history and see how you're going to build an education system that is able to revisit your history, teach people about the history of that place, and revisit the social concept and the social values and the social kind of system in those societies, and look at also the economical kind of priorities, that you want to. Matthew has given examples on, for example, building roads, building bridges, or building agricultural kind of concepts or methodologies.
Industries.
Our societies have a lot of old methodologies of doing agriculture, sustainable ways of cultivating land and producing food. But we have abandoned a lot of those. We need to go back to those and look at them, because some of them were very, very advanced. We need to look at them and see how we can bring them back and modernize them and make them useful to us. When we're talking about building bridges, there are traditional way of building bridges that we have in pre-colonial times. Why don't we go and revisit those and specialize people in doing those kind of things that don't require a lot of technology, don't require a lot of means, but build something that's going to be able to sustain our livelihood and all that for dozens or centuries and centuries. And it works. As long as it works in the communities we need to name. So we need to bring pride into what we have and what we have created and what ancestors have done, and see whether we can modernize those and start kind of working on our own foot. That's why I'm looking at it.
All right, and I want you to comment quickly, any of you, as we're approaching the end, on the need to also look at both work education and mass media education, because education doesn't just happen in schools and university. You actually can learn a lot from work, especially if there's connection between work and education in terms of technical knowledge. All the industries that are functioning, they can train people on a very practical level. And then mass communication, whether we're talking media, we're talking movie production, all these contribute to improving people's mind or changing people's mind in some ways. And then some of these may actually be done without requiring too much money or too much resources. It's just a matter of connecting things. What would you like to? I mean, what are some of the things you would like to see that can be done in this sort of outside of school system education to improve people's education?
That's very interesting point there, because I know Eugene does a lot of work with the producing kind of movies, producing a lot of things about African culture and African things and all that. Maybe he's in a good position to give us some perspectives in that regard, because that's his domain. I personally won't venture making comments on that, because I am not probably the best position to do that, but I left others like Eugene, for example.
Look, I'll try to comment really briefly, because I know that we don't have a huge amount of time.
Yeah.
But I think that with that kind of learning, it's similar to any other kind of learning in the sense that there has to be a balance between recognizing traditional knowledge and traditional culture and indigenous culture, but at the same time, Africa is part of the whole world. So the idea is that everybody wants to have an education that is connected to the rest of the world, and having international input is a very positive thing and a very helpful thing. But I think that African country, and again, we come back to the same thing, African countries, when they need international input for whatever reason, whether it's technical or resources or expertise, they just gravitate to the kind of like the old colonial power, like just as if like by some kind of habit. Instead of maybe thinking, for example, what are countries around the world that have had similar experiences to Africa in some ways and have emerged from those? Like, for example, Finland is a country that has the experience of being colonized and occupied and marginalized in a European context. And today they're recognized as having the most advanced education system in the world. Why not have a collaboration with them instead of going back to France and UK and whoever? Right?
Yeah.
Why not kind of find other countries around the world that have also had the similar experiences and sharing, like, how do we capitalize on our own cultures and on our own resources while being international at the same time? I think a more creative approach to international collaboration and cooperation, not just rejecting, we don't want the West, we don't want Europe, we have everything ourselves, because that's not the reality of the global situation right now. We're all in a global space. I think that's one thing. And the other thing, and I don't want to dwell on it too much, but I think that a lot of young people in Africa are simply scared of education. They're simply scared of learning because they've been brutalized by it. And I think the number one thing to do is to before you start forming committees and institutes and reforming education, is what South Africa did 2 years ago, which was criminalize physical violence against children, corporal punishment of children, and give children legal protection against being assaulted by their teachers, by their parents. And that is number one, because when you do that, when teachers suddenly are not allowed to beat their students, then you realize that half of them are not qualified. They actually don't know how to teach. They don't understand learning difficulties. They don't understand psychological problems of students. They don't have teaching methods. Then you can start figuring out, who, like 70% of our teachers actually don't know how to teach. Then you can start making those changes and implementing your training system practically. That's a very important first step to take, is just protecting students and saying you are not in danger when you go to learn. That's number one for me, I think.
All right, for the time we have left, I'm just going to give everyone maybe a minute or two maximum to make a final comment, because unfortunately we're running out of time. We might have to come back on this on our next episode. Dr. Matthew, go ahead.
Yes, I wanted to respond to a question that was asked earlier on regarding why knowledge from Africa, universities of Africa are not normally cited. And I wanted to say that it depends on the field and the kind of knowledge that you are producing. If you're actually producing good knowledge, people would actually cite you regardless of where you are located. And in my field, for instance, the top scholars, among 10 top scholars, are actually from Africa. One of them is Professor Mahmoud Mamdani. He's one top professor, and he's teaching at the University of Makerere. And he produces knowledge that the world is consuming, and they like that kind of knowledge. We have Kalisus Juma from Kenya, who was talking about technology and development, and he's widely cited. We have, when it comes to decolonization, we have Sebelo and many others. So I genuinely think that if you are creating knowledge that is great enough, academics would actually engage with that knowledge, irrespective of where you come from or where you are located. So that's what I wanted to talk about. Yeah.
Okay. Anybody wants to final words? We're gonna have to finish in a moment. Yeah, go ahead, James. Sorry, I think I put you on mute before. Go ahead. No.
All right. Yeah, I think in terms of educational reform, we do need to clean our curriculum a little bit. There's a lot of either lies or things that kind of make us feel small as Africans that need to be cleaned out. So that's one. But in terms of, I think Matthew has hit the nail on the head. We do need to look at our systems and produce knowledge from there, and like a proper academic research that looks at systems that we had before. It could be financial systems that we had. Like what does it mean to have a loan, for example? We have Islamic, like the reason they formed the Islamic Bank in Australia, it's because it works as well. And we could base ways of lending that we had back home, or ways of working together that could be used everywhere in the world. That's what I just wanted to say.
Okay. Well, we're coming to the end of this show. Almost an hour and 20 minutes. Since we started, we usually do it for an hour, but today we thought we would go a little bit further to give everyone the opportunity to comment. I want to thank you guys for your time to African Knowledge tonight. Obviously, this is a conversation that needs to continue. There's a lot to say. There's a lot to discuss, and we will continue this series until such a time as we think we have exhausted everything we can talk about. Thank you to Dr. Matthew, William Abur, Barry, James, and Eugene, who joined us for the first time. We hope you're going to be available again next time if you can. Your perspective is indeed adds something of value to this discussion. Those of you watching, please, as usual, we ask you to share the video, to like our Facebook page, subscribe to our YouTube channel, click that notification button so you are notified automatically when we go on air or when you produce new knowledge. It's new knowledge anyway, when you produce new videos or anything else. And if you have something to share that you think will add value to the community, do not hesitate to contact us. We're here for that. Until next time, stay safe and stay blessed. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.